Okay, starting in sales, chapter 8, contract terms and gap fillers. Introduction. The code has a very liberal approach to contract formation. If the parties manifest an intent to be bound and expressly agree upon the quantity of goods, the code supplies the rest of the contract terms. For example, price, delivery. And they're citing sections 305 and 307. So these are gap fillers in the code right around the 2-305 and 2-307. Page 172 is where we're finding this reference. Quickly read through the table of contents to chapter 3 of part 3 of article 2 to see all of the topics that are covered by gap fillers. It shouldn't be so hard actually, so I'm gonna do that now. So consider that gap fillers, unless it's in figure 8.3, course of dealing, course of performance, course of dealing, uses of trade are in section 303, which discusses or sets those forth as unless otherwise agreed. Section 305, again, is an open price term. 306, output contracts, requirements, contract, exclusive dealings. 2-307, single lot delivery contract. 2-308, documents of title. 2-309, termination of a contract. 2-310, shipment under reservation. Skipping down to 2-327, consignment. 2-501, identification, and 2-509, risk of loss, Bailey. So, the 300 part, just making sure that this is comparable to what I see in figure 8-03. Asked me to read the table of contents for part 3. And I see general obligations and construction of contract on page, in section 2-301. I don't see I don't see a part 3 other than that. So moving on. Note that sections 2-312 and 2-318, which govern warranties and warranty disclaimers, were discussed in Chapter 6. Remember that gap fillers can be used only if you first establish that the parties actually intended to be bound to a contract. The fewer express terms the parties agree to, the more likely it is that a court will find the parties did not intend to be bound. I have included in this chapter some code provisions outside of Part 3 that others may not commonly include in a list of gap fillers. Specifically, I include all code provisions not discussed elsewhere in this book that help define the rights and obligation of the parties in the absence of express contract terms. The course of performance, course of dealing, or usage of trade. Figure 8-2 shows how the gap fillers supplement the parties' express terms to constitute parties' total legal obligation. Figure 8-3 I just read sets forth the code sections and definitions that we will study in this chapter. So I get to skip page 173 because it was just read. Part 2 of this chapter, course of performance, course of dealing, usage of trade. Short section. Once a court is convinced that the parties did intend to be bound and has identified and interpreted express contract terms, the court will turn to the code gap fillers, unless expressly negated by the parties. Course of performance, course of dealing, and the usage of trade are all considered to be part of the parties' contract, whether or not expressly stated in the contract documents. Because these concepts are so important, we discussed them earlier in Chapter 1. So next section, Part 3 of Chapter 8, regarding gap fillers, is the price. New students are often surprised to learn that parties can conclude an enforceable contract under Section 2 without an express agreement on the price term. Contrary to the common law rule, that would usually lead to a conclusion that the agreement lacked the necessary specificity to enforce. Sections 2-204 and 2-305 specifically contemplate that parties can agree to be bound without agreeing on a specific price term. In such an event, the default rule is usually that the price is a reasonable price at the time of delivery. Another contrast to common law contracts is that the parties must conclude an enforceable contract that leaves the price to be fixed by the seller or the buyer. A possible attack on such a promise is illusory is saved by the code provision that requires the responsible party to fix the price in good faith. Part 4 details the delivery. Sections 2-307 through 2-310 provide default rules for parties who fail to specify certain details regarding delivery, such as the time for shipment or delivery, when payment is due, whether delivery is to be in single lots or several lots, and the delivery place. Section 5 of gap fillers, options and cooperation regarding performance. As indicated by its title, Section 3-11 states the default rules respecting performance for contracts. Is that what it's called? They didn't give me the title. Maybe that is the title. Options and cooperation regarding performance. Let's go to the code. I was probably searching the wrong thing before. Is this the restatement? Yeah, it's the restatement. Article 2. Okay, now I'm seeing short titles. I wasn't seeing before. Last time I went, I guess, to the restatement, I think. Let's see. There's no section. No, there's no section introduction. I lie. But the section title of 2-311, which is supposed to be explanatory in its title, is, as I just explained, options and cooperation regarding or respecting performance. So, that leave particulars of performance to be specified by one of the parties, or two that are silent with respect to which party specifies the assortment of goods or shipping arrangements. It also states the options of a party awaiting performance when the party obligated to state specifications fails to do so in a timely manner. Section 6, identification, insurable interest. As you first saw in Chapter 3, the concept of identification may be important in determining whether a particular transaction is within the scope of Article 2. It is also important in determining the rights and obligations of the parties. Specifically, the definitional cross-references that follow Section 2-501 indicate that identification is important in connections with a buyer's right to reclamation under Section 2-502, risk of loss under Sections 2-509 and 2-510, ascertaining a seller's remedy for breach of contract under 2-703, applying the gap filler provision of a place of delivery. Section 2-308, and a manner of seller's delivery under 2-503. However, the definitional cross-references omit several important cross-references. Section 2-513 regarding buyer's right to inspect goods Sections 2-613, which we study in Chapter 10 on excuse and a buyer's right to replan under 2-716. As you also learn in Chapter 3, the code does not define identification. Reread Chapter 3, Section 2.1 now. Although Section 2-501 does not define identification, it does attempt to define when identification occurs. Thus, it distinguishes between goods that are both existing and identified at the time of the contract and future goods which are not. Note that Section 2-501 is a default rule. So you've got an exercise on identification on that page 175 of the book, of the case book. And then you see an explanatory or exemplary case in re Ronnie Lynn Carmen debtor, in re Carmen Boats Inc. debtor. And I started reading that and reviewing it in class about this almost finished yacht, which the court actually did not find to be identified so that it could be used to satisfy debt, like bankruptcy, rather than probably do what the consumer would have liked, which is get a boat that they paid $300,000 for or more. Section 7, risk of loss in general. The code's risk of loss provisions are another significant group of gap fillers. Contract parties often fail to expressly address the risk that after they enter into a contract, but before the buyer receives the goods may be lost, damaged, or destroyed without the fault of either party. Before performance begins, the risk of loss is always on the seller, and after the contract is fully performed, it is always on the buyer. The question then is, exactly when is the risk of loss transferred from the seller to buyer? The answer to this question is critical. If the goods are lost or damaged after the risk passes to the buyer must pay the contract price for goods it does not receive. If the goods are lost while the seller still bears the risk, the seller cannot recover the price, and unless the loss excuses performance, the seller also is liable to the buyer for damages for breach of contract if the seller cannot deliver substitute goods. Based on your understanding of the basic philosophy of Article 3. 2. You should now expect that the parties may expressly agree about when the risk of loss passes. One common way that parties do this is by including as express contract terms the various shipment terms defined under Sections 2-319. I think I wrote this down. Of course I didn't. I'll write it in another color. 2-319 and 328 are shipment terms. They might be gap filler terms, anyhow. Previously discussed in Chapter 7, if the parties do not allocate the risk of loss to gap filler provisions, Section 509 and 2-510 allocate the risk of loss. Gap fillers regarding shipment risk of loss are in Sections 2-509 and 5. Okay. 510 applies when one party is in breach. So Section 8, risk of loss, no breach. Section 2-509 divides contracts into 3 groups. And 3 categories based on how the goods are to be delivered to the buyer. 1, contracts requiring or authorizing the seller to ship the goods to the buyer by a carrier. These contracts are further divided into A, those that require authorized shipment but do not make the seller responsible for the actual delivery of the buyer's destination shipment contracts, and those who make the seller responsible for the actual delivery of a particular destination. So you see A and B under number 1. And then you see 2 and 3 in the other categories. So 2 is contracts for the sale of goods in the possession of a third-party bailee that are to be delivered without being moved. And third, all other contracts, including those in which the seller delivers the goods by its own vehicles and those in which the buyer takes delivery at the seller's place of business. Okay, so they kind of like carry away grocery store stuff. But category number 1, just rereading it, contracts requiring or otherwise authorizing the seller to ship the goods to the buyer by a carrier. And so you've got A and B under that. Those that require to authorize shipment but do not make the seller responsible, and those where the seller is responsible. Destination contracts, in other words. So here's a warning. Both destination and shipment contracts may provide the seller with a ship to address. The language of section 509(1) is somewhat misleading because it suggests that any term requiring the seller to arrange for shipment to a specified destination creates a destination contract. An important question under section 5-2-509 is not whether the seller must ship to a named destination, but at what stage along the route the event of tender occurs and the risk of lost ships. Use the presumption of official comment 5 to section 2-503 that a shipment contract is intended unless the parties use the specific destination contract terms in sections 2-319 and 2-320 so as to make risk of loss pass at buyer's destination. A lot of sections there in risk of loss for no breach. But when there is a breach, section 2-510 applies, and it's divided in 3 sections. The first 2 apply to breach by a seller, and the third applies to breach by a buyer. Essentially, these subsections state that the risk of loss is on the breaching party, but only to the extent that the non-breaching parties insurance does not cover the loss. The official comments to section 2-510 make clear that the drafters intended the result to leave the loss on insurance companies, so the principle of subrogation does not apply. Then there's a bunch of exercises, and that's actually the end of chapter 8.